Fire had never fallen from a clear sky before, not like this. The Hindu Kush had seen war for generations, but nothing that streaked down through the thermosphere, trailing plasma, and left a crater still glowing. Hours after impact, no radar station on Earth had tracked an incoming object. No satellite had flagged a launch. It was as if the thing had simply appeared, already falling, already burning. Master Chief Petty Officer Elena Cross had been in worse places than a frozen mountainside at 0300 hours. But she had never approached an objective with this particular flavor of dread. Her earpiece crackled with the voice of her JSOC handler, terse and stripped of the usual dry humor. Ground team, be advised, whatever's down there isn't matching any known signature. Not Chinese, not Russian, not ours. Command wants eyes on before anyone touches it. Cross exchanged a glance with her second, a British SAS operator named Mallory, who'd been seconded to the joint task force for exactly this kind of anomaly. 6 operators. For nationalities, 1 mission. Find out what the hell had punched a hole in the mountainside, and figure out if it was a threat. The crater itself defied easy description. The rock at its lip had been vitrified, fused into black glass by heat that no conventional munition or meteor could produce. At the center, half buried in scorched earth, sat a sphere roughly 2 meters in diameter. Its surface, a mesh of dark alloy panels and clustered sensor nodes that pulsed with a faint, rhythmic blue light, like something breathing. That's not a rock, Mallory murmured, training his rifle on it anyway, as if a weapon built to kill men could do anything against whatever this was. Cross approached slowly, her boots crunching on glassy debris. Up close, the object radiated a low hum, barely audible, felt more in the teeth than the ears. Scorch patterns radiated outward from articulated limbs folded against its hull. Limbs. She realized, not landing struts. This thing had arms. Sensor arrays. A presence that felt less like fallen debris and more like something that had been watching, and was still watching, even broken. Command, this isn't a satellite, she said into her calm. This is a machine. Some kind of probe. It's got optics, it's got. She paused as one of the blue lights flared brighter, swiveling with unmistakable intent toward her position. It's still active. The response from command was immediate. Fall back. Do not engage. We're scrambling, an exploitation team. But Cross had spent 15 years reading threats, and this one was reading her right back. The sphere's central aperture, an optical sensor unlike any camera she'd seen, faceted like an insect's eye, fixed on her with something that felt disturbingly like recognition. Then, with a soft, mechanical whine, it began transmitting. Not radio, not anything her team's equipment could intercept. A tight, directed burst aimed skyward, gone in less than a second, and then the blue lights dimmed to nothing. It just sent something, she said. Up. Whatever that was, it phoned home. 6,000 miles away, in a windowless room beneath the Pentagon. Analysts were already replaying the burst transmission, running it through every decryption algorithm in the American arsenal and getting nothing but noise, an encryption architecture, so far beyond anything terrestrial that the machines, meant to break it simply, returned error after error, as if the code itself refused to exist within Earth's mathematics. What none of them yet understood, what only became clear in the following 72 hours, as astronomers tracked a series of faint gravitational anomalies at the edge of the solar system, anomalies that resolved, impossibly, into ships, was that the probe had done exactly what it was built to do. It had found a world. It had assessed that world's technology, its defenses, its vulnerability, and it had called for a fleet. The Galactic Empire had found Earth the same way it had found 100 worlds before it, quietly, methodically, without warning, and without any interest in the answer to a question it had never bothered to ask. The Empire did not seek permission. It sought territory, and it had just discovered an entire world that did not know war could look like this. Elena Cross stood in that crater long after the exploitation team arrived to haul the probe away for study, staring up at a sky that had, until 3 hours ago, seemed entirely her own planet's business. She didn't know the word empire yet. She didn't know the name Vader, or Palpatine, or the Death Star that had already come and gone in a galaxy she couldn't conceive of. All she knew was that something had come down from the stars, watched them, and left, and that whatever answered that call would not be friendly. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Wars galaxy, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. May the Force be with you. Within the week, the multinational task force she commanded would have a new designation, a new mandate, and an enemy unlike anything human history had prepared them for. The mountains of Afghanistan had given the world its first glimpse of the Empire's reach. The skies over the Pacific would soon give it something far worse. A Star Destroyer, breaking atmosphere, casting a shadow 3 kilometers long across the waves, and Master Chief Elena Cross would be there when the first stormtroopers set foot on Earth's soil, radios crackling with reports. No one back home would believe until it was already too late to matter. The Pacific had never held a shadow like this before. Fishing boats off the coast of Guam were the first to report it. Not a storm cloud, not an aircraft carrier, but something vast and angular blotting out the morning sun. 3 kilometers of gray hull hanging in the sky with a silence that felt obscene given its size. By the time military satellites confirmed what dozens of terrified radio calls had already described, the object had a designation in 3 different national defense databases. Unknown Contact Zulu 1. It would not stay unknown for long. Master Chief Elena Cross watched the feed from a forward command post on Guam. The Joint Task Force, now operating under a name hastily assigned by a Pentagon working group that hadn't slept in 4 days, Task Force Vanguard. Around her, operators from 6 nations studied grainy satellite imagery of the Star Destroyer's underside, searching for anything resembling a weak point, a vulnerability, a reason to hope. "That's not possible," said Lieutenant Commander Yuki Tanaka, a JMSDF officer who'd been folded into Vanguard's intelligence cell. "The mass alone, there's no way that thing is generating lift through conventional means." "It's not conventional," Cross said. "Nothing about this is." The ship, later identified through recovered Imperial data as the Star Destroyer, Harrower's reach, held position at 40,000 feet. Its presence alone enough to ground every commercial flight across the Pacific Basin. Then, without warning or transmission, it began deploying craft, sleek, wedge-shaped shuttles descending on trails of blue-white fire, along with smaller, faster fighters that split off toward population centers with unnerving precision, as if they already possessed maps humanity had never shared. Cross's team wasn't assigned to intercept the main landing force. That dubious honor belonged to a Marine Expeditionary Unit off the USS Tripoli, backed by fighter squadrons scrambling from 3 Allied air bases. Vanguard's mission was reconnaissance, get eyes on ground troops, assess capability, survive. They didn't have to wait long. A shuttle grounded on a remote stretch of Guam's northern coastline, and Cross watched through a rifle scope as its ramp lowered to disgorge a squad of white-armored soldiers moving with disciplined, almost robotic precision. Stormtroopers. The word wouldn't enter common usage for another 6 hours. Once recovered helmet cameras and captured comm chatter gave humanity a name for what it was facing. For now, they were simply them. 8 figures in featureless white plate, carrying rifles that hummed with contained energy, spreading into a perimeter with textbook infantry discipline. Contact. 8 hostiles. Small arms, moving in standard fireteam wedge. Cross whispered into her comm, cataloging everything with the flat professionalism that had kept her alive through 3 wars already. No visible support weapons. Repeat, no heavy weapons visible. It was Mallory who made first contact, and not by choice. A trooper's patrol route brought it within 15 meters of his concealed position, and some instinct, call it training, call it the primal alarm, of prey sensing a predator, made the soldier's helmet snap toward the tree lean exactly where Mallory lay hidden. The world's first exchange of fire between Earth and the Galactic Empire lasted 4 seconds. Mallory's suppressed rifle round took the trooper center mass, and Cross watched with something between relief and horror as the man simply crumpled. The armor, for all its alien menace, offered no more protection against a 7.62 millimeters round than a Kevlar best might have. That was the first data point that mattered. They could be killed by Earth weapons. That was also, in the next half second, the moment everything went wrong. Because the surviving troopers didn't panic. didn't scatter for cover in confusion. They oriented on Mallory's position with terrifying speed and returned fire, bolts of blue-white energy that struck trees and stone with concussive force, superheating everything they touched. Contact left, danger close. Cross was moving before she finished the sentence, closing on Mallory's flank while two more operators laid down suppressing fire. The stormtrooper's accuracy, she noted even as adrenaline flooded her system, was worse than expected. Their weapons were devastating, but their training seemed calibrated for suppression and area denial, rather than precision marksmanship. It was a weakness, the first of many they would need to catalog if humanity intended to survive what was coming. The engagement ended in 90 seconds. For troopers dead, killed by a combination of suppressed rifle fire and, in one case, a well-placed knife when an operator named Du Bois got inside a trooper's minimum engagement range. The remaining four fell back toward their shuttle, one of them shouting into a helmet comm in a clipped, accented English that suggested, chillingly, a galaxy where humans weren't native to Earth at all, but simply another outpost of a species that had spread far beyond anything Cross could comprehend. They didn't pursue. Vanguard's mandate was intelligence, not annihilation, and Cross had learned enough in 90 seconds to know that whatever came next would require far more than 6 operators and a scavenged knife kill. As the shuttle lifted away, trailing smoke from a grenade Du Bois had managed to cook off against its hull. Cross knelt beside the body of the first trooper killed and began, with clinical detachment, stripping the armor for intelligence. Beneath the white plate was a man, younger than she'd expected, a face marked by exhaustion and, in death, an expression that looked less like a soldier of a galactic empire and more like every conscript she'd ever seen die far from home for reasons he likely never chose. It was a detail she would carry with her through everything that followed, that the Empire's soldiers, for all their alien technology, bled and died and feared exactly like men. Whether that would make them easier to defeat or harder to hate, she didn't yet know. 26 hours after the first shots were fired on Guam, every head of state on Earth received the same transmission simultaneously, broadcast on frequencies no government owned and no engineer could trace to a terrestrial source. It arrived in every major language, translated with unsettling fluency, spoken by a voice that carried the bored, administrative cadence of a man reading a routine memo rather than delivering an ultimatum to an entire species. The speaker identified himself as Grand Moff Tarnis Ordain, Imperial Governor-Designate of what Imperial Cartography now labeled Sector Terra Prime. His message was brief. Earth's governments were to cease all hostile action against Imperial forces immediately. A formal delegation would arrive within 72 hours to negotiate terms of voluntary incorporation into the Galactic Empire. Failure to comply, Ordain noted with the same flat indifference he might use to discuss shipping manifests, would result in the Empire securing compliance through demonstrative action against non-essential population centers. The world did not have 72 hours to process what that meant. It had perhaps 6 before the first cracks appeared in the fragile unity that had briefly united humanity's militaries under the banner of Task Force Vanguard. Elena Cross watched the fracture happen in real time from a secure briefing room in Guam, patched into an emergency session of what remained of the UN Security Council. The Chinese and Russian representatives were arguing, through gritted diplomatic teeth, that negotiation was the only rational path, that no combination of Earth's militaries could meaningfully oppose a force capable of interstellar travel, and that survival meant accommodation, however bitter. The American and European delegations were split, some advocating resistance as a matter of principle, others quietly calculating whether early cooperation might secure their nations a more favorable position within whatever new order was coming. They're going to fold, Tanaka said quietly beside her, watching the same feed. Half of them are already looking for the best deal they can get. Can you blame them? Cross asked, though the question tasted like ash. We killed 4 stormtroopers with rifles and a knife. That ship over Guam alone could probably level a continent if it wanted to. It was a fact the Empire seemed entirely aware of and entirely willing to exploit. Within hours of Ordain's broadcast, additional star destroyers began translating into low orbit above 6 other major population centers: Lagos, Mumbai, Sao Paulo, Los Angeles, Shanghai, Berlin, a deliberate, calculated show of force designed to fracture any possibility of unified resistance by making the cost of geological warfare on a planetary scale, and it was working. Cross had seen counterinsurgency doctrine from every angle in her career, had been the counterinsurgent, and, in training exercises, had role-played the insurgent to better understand the enemy's mindset. What the Empire was executing wasn't conquest through overwhelming force alone. It was conquest through the careful cultivation of despair, convincing an entire species that resistance was not just costly but pointless, that the wisest choice was the quiet one. The first government to break was, unsurprisingly, one already destabilized by internal conflict, a fractured administration desperate for any external validation of its legitimacy. Within 18 hours, its representatives had opened back-channel communications with the orbiting imperial delegation, offering resource concessions and territorial access in exchange for protected status once occupation began. It would not be the last. Cross's intelligence briefings over the following days read like a slow motion collapse. 3 more governments quietly, signaling willingness to negotiate, each one weakening the resolve of those still undecided, each one making Vanguard's mission feel increasingly like a doomed rearguard action rather than the vanguard of anything. But not everyone was folding. In a windowless annex beneath what remained of a joint NATO command structure, a different kind of conversation was happening, one that would never appear in any official record. General Marcus Webb, the American officer nominally overseeing Vanguard's chain of command, gathered Cross and a handful of other senior operators for a briefing that carried the distinct, uncomfortable weight of men and women being asked to consider something well outside their lawful orders. Officially, Webb said, our mandate is reconnaissance and defense of designated assets. Officially, Vanguard doesn't engage Imperial forces without explicit authorization from a joint command structure that, as of 6 hours ago, includes 3 governments actively negotiating our surrender. He paused, letting that land. Unofficially, I've been given some latitude. There are people in this room, and people above my pay grade, who don't believe accommodation is going to save anyone. History doesn't have a lot of examples of empires that occupy a world and then leave it better off. Cross thought of the dead trooper's face beneath his helmet, of the casual cruelty embedded in a broadcast that treated an entire species like a line item to be reconciled. She thought of every insurgency she'd studied, every asymmetric conflict where a smaller, less equipped force had bled a superior power through patience, terrain, and the simple refusal to accept the terms being offered. What's the latitude, sir? She asked. Webb's expression didn't change, but something in his voice sharpened. Vanguard operates outside official channels going forward. No government sanction, no diplomatic cover, no acknowledgement if it goes wrong. We gather intelligence, we identify vulnerabilities. And if this ultimatum expires, without a negotiated settlement that doesn't amount to surrender, we make the Empire's occupation a great deal more expensive than Grand Moff Ordain is currently budgeting for. It was, Cross understood, an invitation to become something closer to insurgents than soldiers, operating against not just an alien empire, but potentially against her own government's official position. Should that government choose capitulation? She thought of Mallory, of Du Bois, of every operator in that Guam Treeline who'd proven that Imperial troopers bled like anyone else. I'm in, she said. Around the room, one by one, so was everyone else. The task force that reassembled 6 days later bore little resemblance to the 6-person reconnaissance element that had first walked into a crater in the Hindu Kush. What emerged from a series of clandestine meetings, off-book resource transfers, and quiet defections from official chains of command was something closer to a shadow army task force. Vanguard in name, but in practice a coalition of the willing drawn from every special operations community on Earth that still believed resistance meant something. Elena Cross found herself, somewhat to her own disbelief, serving as de facto operational commander of a force that included SEAL Team 6 veterans, SAS operators who'd quietly gone absent without leave from a British government now openly courting imperial negotiators, a cell of French GIGN counterterrorism specialists, Israeli Sayeret, Makal operators whose government had refused outright to consider capitulation, and a scattering of others, Australian SASR, Polish GROM, South Korean 707th, each arriving through backchannels that traced back to General Webb's quietly expanding network of officers who shared his conviction that accommodation was a slower kind of surrender. They numbered perhaps 300 by the end of the first week. It was, by any conventional military calculus, a laughably small force to oppose an empire that spanned a galaxy. But conventional calculus, Cross had come to understand, was not the metric that mattered. The empire's own doctrine, gleaned from captured equipment and the growing pile of intelligence Vanguard's analysts were assembling, revealed an occupying force built for overwhelming, centralized dominance, not for the kind of dispersed, adaptive guerrilla resistance that Earth's special operations community had spent 70 years perfecting against enemies who couldn't match them in open battle either. They're not built for this, Tanaka said during a planning session held in a decommissioned mining facility beneath the Australian outback, chosen specifically for its distance from any satellite Imperial forces had yet mapped. She gestured at a display cobbled together from captured Imperial data slates and recovered helmet cameras. Every engagement report we've pulled shows the same pattern. Stormtrooper doctrine assumes numerical and technological superiority as a given. They're trained to overwhelm, not to adapt. When Guam's engagement went sideways on them, thereafter action pattern, assuming Imperial documentation works anything like ours, almost certainly reads as an anomaly, rather than a preview. So we keep giving them anomalies, Cross said. The strategy that took shape over the following days was, in its bones, nothing new to anyone. In that room, it was the same doctrine that had bled empires for centuries, adapted now to an enemy from beyond the stars. Hit small, isolated elements. Never engage a fortified position directly. Exploit terrain the empire's sensors and doctrine hadn't accounted for dense urban environments, subterranean infrastructure, jungle canopy, Arctic conditions that fouled equipment, calibrated for climate-controlled starship interiors. Bleed them slowly, gather intelligence constantly, and above all, deny the empire the one thing its entire strategy depended on. The psychological conviction that resistance was futile. Captured equipment offered the first real breakthroughs. A recovered stormtrooper helmet, disassembled by a joint team of engineers from 6 nations working in circumstances that would have been considered scientifically impossible a month earlier, revealed vulnerabilities that no amount of galactic technological superiority could fully offset. Imperial blaster rifles, devastating as they were, ran on replaceable power cells with finite charges, supply lines that, unlike a soldier's ammunition pouch, couldn't simply be manufactured locally without access to technology Earth didn't possess, meaning every blaster bolt fired was a resource the Empire would eventually need to resupply from orbit. Stormtrooper armor, while resistant to shrapnel and blunt trauma, offered negligible protection against sustained rifle fire at range, a fact grimly confirmed in the Guam engagement and reconfirmed in 3 subsequent skirmishes Vanguard cells had initiated and immediately disengaged from. Hit and fade strikes designed to gather data rather than hold ground. More troubling was the intelligence regarding Imperial command structure. Ordain, the Grand Moff overseeing what the Empire now formally designated Sector Terra Prime, answered to a chain of command that stretched back to an Imperial capital light years distant, but reports intercepted from Imperial communications, painstakingly decoded by a cryptography team that included veterans of the NSA and Britain's GCHQ, suggested Earth's occupation had drawn attention from considerably higher up that chain than a single sector's resistance would normally warrant. There were references, fragmentary and unconfirmed, to a figure whose designation alone seemed to trigger a different register of urgency in every Imperial transmission that mentioned him, Lord Vader. We don't have a clean picture of what that is yet. Webb admitted during a full task force briefing. But every piece of chatter we've pulled treats this name like it outranks fear itself. I want everyone treating that designation as Priority 1 intelligence. If this Vader shows up here personally, that changes the entire character of this fight. Cross filed the name away with the same cold professional attention she gave every emerging threat. Though something about the way Imperial officers referenced him, the clipped, careful language, the total absence of the casual arrogance that characterized every other Imperial communication they'd intercepted settled into her gut as something worth losing sleep over. For now, though, Vanguard's first true test wouldn't come from Vader. It would come from the growing list of governments quietly finalizing terms of capitulation, and the question of what humanity's resistance would do when its own leaders began actively working against it. The captured shuttle sat in a hangar bay carved into solid rock beneath the Australian outback, and Elena Cross spent 3 sleepless days watching a team of engineers, physicists, and one deeply unnerved Imperial defector take it apart piece by piece. That last detail, the defector, had arrived 4 days earlier through channels Cross still didn't fully understand, delivered by a GIGN extraction team that had intercepted him fleeing a downed Imperial supply craft in the Pyrenees. His name, or the name he gave, was Reith Kahlo, a former Imperial technician who claimed conscription rather than conviction had put him in Imperial white, and whose knowledge of Imperial systems was proving worth more than every other piece of captured hardware combined. You have to understand, Kahlo said, standing awkwardly among engineers twice his age who regarded him with the wary fascination of men studying a new and possibly dangerous species. The Empire didn't build its military doctrine to fight insurgents. It built it to fight other militaries, fleets, armies, things it could see coming and crush with overwhelming force. What you're doing, hitting small, vanishing, hitting somewhere else, it's not in the training manuals. Most officers I served under would call it dishonorable. That doesn't mean it isn't effective. It means they don't have a doctrine for beating it quickly. The intelligence Kahlo provided, cross-referenced against the wreckage of the shuttle and the equipment recovered from 4 separate skirmishes, painted a picture of the Empire's strengths and, more valuably, its weaknesses. Blaster technology was devastating in direct engagement, but relied on power cells that degraded with use and required specialized recharging equipment the Empire hadn't yet established on Earth in any distributed way, meaning every unit operating away from a main garrison was operating on a finite and shrinking resource. Stormtrooper armor, while effective against shrapnel and blunt force trauma, had never been designed with modern ballistic threats in mind. A galaxy that had largely moved past kinetic firearms in favor of energy weapons had built armor optimized for a threat profile Earth simply didn't match. Then there's this, Kahlo said, pulling up a schematic on a recovered data slate that made Tanaka lean in sharply. TIE fighters. Fast, maneuverable, deadly in atmosphere and void alike. But no shields. None. Imperial doctrine treats pilot casualties as an acceptable cost of maintaining maneuverability. There are more clone-descended and conscripted pilots than there are ships, historically. It means a single well-placed hit from something as basic as a shoulder-fired missile can kill a TIE outright. Your surface-to-air systems, calibrated properly, could be far more effective against Imperial fighters than anyone in this hangar currently believes. Cross felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel since the crater in the Hindu Kush, the cold, clarifying shape of a plan. Not hope. Exactly. Hope felt like a luxury she couldn't afford yet, but the beginning of a framework. An enemy that looked invincible from a distance and, up close, bled from wounds humanity already knew how to inflict. Then Kahlo mentioned Vader, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. You keep asking about the name, he said quietly, no longer meeting anyone's eyes. I served 3 years in a garrison that once had him inspected. I watched him choke an officer to death from across a room without touching him. No weapon, no visible cause. The man simply couldn't breathe. And then he was on the floor, and Vader had already moved on to the next inspection point like nothing had happened. That's not possible, said one of the physicists. Reflexively, the way anyone raised on the laws of Earth's physics might reject a story that violated every one of them. I didn't say it was possible, Kalos said. I said I watched it happen. There's an energy field, the Empire calls it the Force. Most people can't touch it at all. Some can touch it a little. Vader touches it like it belongs to him. Telekinesis. Precognition, some say. He can find a hidden fleet by feeling for it. I don't know how you fight something like that with rifles. The room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with rank or discipline. Cross had spent her career building confidence out of variables. She could measure range, caliber, terrain, morale. Kahlo's account introduced a variable that resisted measurement entirely, and she recognized the danger immediately. An enemy that couldn't be quantified was an enemy that could unravel the fragile confidence. Vanguard's engineers had spent 3 days rebuilding. Then we don't fight him, she said, cutting through the silence before it calcified into fear. Not directly. We've built this entire strategy around avoiding fair fights with an enemy that outmatches us on paper. Vader's just one more variable we route around, not through. If he shows up, our job is to not be where he's looking. It was, she knew even as she said it, an answer built more on necessity than confidence. But necessity had carried Vanguard this far, and she watched the room's tension ease fractionally. Engineers returning to their work with the particular determination of people who needed a plan more than they needed certainty. Kahlo lingered after the others dispersed, studying Cross with an expression she couldn't quite place, something between pity and reluctant respect. For what it's worth, he said, I've served on 3 worlds the Empire pacified before this one. None of them fought back the way you're fighting. Most surrendered within days. I don't know if that means you'll win, but I don't think Grand Moff Ordain understood what he was landing on when he chose this planet. Cross said nothing, but she filed the observation away alongside the name Vader, alongside every fragment of intelligence that suggested Earth might be more than a simple pacification exercise, might, in fact, be becoming a problem the Empire hadn't budgeted for at all. The ambush at Sector Terra Prime's forward garrison outside Manila took 11 days to plan and 90 seconds to execute, and by the time it ended, Grand Moff Ordain's carefully constructed narrative of inevitable, painless annexation had suffered a wound it would never fully recover from. Elena Cross had chosen the target with deliberate care. The garrison was a mid-sized Imperial logistics hub, not a heavily defended command post, but a resupply and vehicle maintenance depot responsible for servicing the walkers and speeder bikes the Empire had begun deploying to enforce curfews across Southeast Asian population centers where local governments had refused Imperial terms. It was exactly the kind of target Kahlo had identified as structurally vulnerable, important enough to hurt the Empire's logistics, undefended enough that a strike team could reach it, without triggering the kind of overwhelming response a strike on a command post would invite. The plan itself was almost insultingly simple by the standards of anti-terrorism operations Cross had run throughout her career, which was, she'd come to realize, precisely the point. The Empire's counterinsurgency doctrine, gleaned from 3 weeks of intercepted communications and Kahlo's exhaustive debriefings, was built around large-scale suppression, overwhelming force, mass reprisals, technological dominance. It had no meaningful answer for 16 operators, infiltrating on foot through jungle terrain that Imperial sensor arrays, calibrated for open, largely vegetation-free environments across 100 worlds struggled to penetrate with full fidelity. Sensor blind spots confirmed at these 3 points. Tanaka had briefed 2 days earlier, highlighting a schematic built from months of captured technical data. Dense canopy plus mineral deposits in the local rock create enough interference that Imperial ground sensors read these zones as low priority. It won't make us invisible. It'll make us unremarkable, which is better. The strike itself unfolded with the precision of operators who had spent careers rehearsing exactly this kind of asymmetric violence. Charges placed against the garrisons, fuel reserves, and vehicle maintenance. They detonated in a coordinated sequence timed to coincide with a shift. Change, the single window when Imperial security patterns, rigid and predictable in ways no human insurgent force would ever be, thinned to their most exploitable configuration. Secondary charges took out a communications relay tower before it could broadcast a distress call, a task handled by Du Bois and a French contingent that had spent a week rehearsing the climb in a mock-up built from salvaged scaffolding. By the time surviving stormtroopers organized any coherent response, 4 AT-ST walkers sat wreathed in flame. The garrison's fuel depot had become a column of black smoke visible from 20 kilometers away, and Vanguard's strike team was already 3 kilometers into the jungle, moving in staggered formation toward extraction points that shifted every 6 hours. According to a schedule, only Cross and Webb held in full. It was, by any measure, a stunning tactical victory, and it was also, Cross understood immediately upon receiving the after-action report, a turning point whose consequences would extend far beyond the garrison itself. Imperial communications, intercepted in the following hours, carried a tone distinctly different from the clipped administrative confidence that had characterized every transmission since Ordain's initial ultimatum. There was anger in them now, something that, in a species so committed to its own inevitability, read almost like disbelief. More significantly, within 36 hours, Imperial fleet dispositions across Sector Terra Prime shifted in ways that Vanguard's intelligence cell had not anticipated and, in truth, had not entirely wanted. A significant portion of Imperial naval assets, previously distributed across multiple negotiating population centers, began consolidating toward Southeast Asia, an encrypted fleet. Communications, still only partially decoded, carried a designation that sent a chill through the command bunker when Kahlo confirmed its translation. Personal transport, executor class command shuttle. Designation, Lord Vader. He's coming here, Webb said quietly, staring at the projection of Imperial fleet movements. Not a garrison commander, not a sector admiral. Him. Cross felt the weight of that settle over the command bunker like a physical pressure. She thought of Kahlo's account, an officer choking to death across a room. No weapon, no explanation, and forced herself to separate the fear from the tactical reality. Fear was useful only as far as it sharpened planning. Beyond that, it was simply a liability, and she couldn't afford liabilities with an Imperial response bearing down on a position her strike team had already begun evacuating. Then we're not here when he arrives, she said. Full withdrawal from the Manila AO within 6 hours. Every cell disperses to secondary locations. We prove the concept. The Empire can be hurt. We don't need to prove it twice by handing whatever. Vader actually is a stationary target. The order went out within the hour, and Vanguard's network dissolved back into the shadows it had emerged from. 300 operators scattering across a planet the Empire had assumed would be pacified within a week. But even as Cross oversaw the withdrawal, she understood that the garrison strike had changed the calculus of this war in ways that couldn't be undone. Ordain's occupation had drawn the attention of something the Empire itself seemed to regard with something close to dread, and whatever came next would no longer be a matter of quiet negotiation and gradual capitulation. The Empire had sent its most feared enforcer to a planet that had, until 3 weeks ago, believed itself entirely alone in the universe. Cross intended to make certain he found nothing waiting for him but ghosts. The betrayal, when it came, didn't arrive with the drama Cross had half expected. It arrived as a diplomatic cable, leaked to Vanguard's intelligence network by a sympathetic staffer inside a government that had spent 3 weeks publicly condemning Imperial aggression while privately negotiating something far more damning than mere surrender. The document detailed a formal cooperation agreement between the Empire and a coalition of governments, representing nearly a third of Earth's population, an arrangement that went well beyond the passive capitulation Cross had anticipated from nations too frightened or too pragmatic to resist. In exchange for protected administrative status, once imperial rule was formalized, these governments had agreed to provide something the empire apparently valued above territorial control alone: intelligence on Vanguard's operations, drawn from military and law enforcement assets those same governments still nominally commanded. "They're going to hunt us with our own people," Tanaka said, reading the cable a second time as if repetition might reveal a less damning interpretation. It didn't. Cross read the list of signatory governments twice, feeling something colder than anger settle into her chest, a specific, professional dread that had nothing to do with blaster fire or walkers or a Sith Lord's approaching shuttle, and everything to do with the much older, much more familiar danger of an enemy that knew her operational patterns, her extraction routes, her people's faces. The document named names, included among the intelligence assets the cooperating governments had pledged to the Empire, was a joint counterterrorism database that Cross herself had helped build over a decade of prior service, a database containing biometric profiles, known associates, and operational histories for dozens of the very operators now serving under Vanguard's banner. Handed over intact, it would give Imperial intelligence analysts a roadmap to identifying, locating, and eliminating exactly the kind of dispersed, adaptive resistance network that had made the Manila garrison strike possible. Webb called an emergency session within the hour, and the debate that followed was the ugliest Cross had witnessed since Vanguard's formation. Some argued for immediate, aggressive action against the cooperating governments themselves, sabotage, even targeted strikes against the officials who'd signed the agreement, treating collaboration as a threat equal to Imperial occupation. Others argued for restraint, warning that turning Vanguard's guns against fellow humans, however compromised, would validate every Imperial narrative about the chaos and savagery of an unpacified world, and would fracture whatever remained of humanity's fragile unity beyond repair. Cross found herself caught between both positions, understanding the visceral logic of each while trusting neither completely. She'd spent her career believing in chains of command, in the idea that soldiers served something larger than personal judgment, and she'd watched that belief erode steadily since the crater in the Hindu Kush, replaced by something more dangerous and more necessary: the conviction that when the institutions meant to protect people began actively endangering them, loyalty to those institutions became its own kind of betrayal. "We're not going to become what we're fighting," she said finally, cutting through a debate that had begun to circle without resolution. "We don't put a bullet in a politician for making a bad decision under an impossible gun, but we also don't sit still while our own biometric files get handed to the people trying to kill us." She turned to Tanaka. "How fast can we corrupt that database before it's transferred?" The operation that followed was, in its way, as delicate as the Manila strike had been direct: a cyber intrusion executed by a team of signals intelligence specialists, drawn from Israeli, American, and South Korean assets, designed not to destroy the compromised database outright, but to seed it with corrupted entries, false operational histories, and misattributed biometric data that would poison Imperial analysis, without alerting the cooperating governments that their betrayal had been detected. It was a smaller victory than the garrison strike, invisible to anyone outside Vanguard's command structure. But Cross understood its importance immediately. It bought time. And in an asymmetric war against an empire that spanned the galaxy, time was the only resource Vanguard genuinely possessed in any abundance. But the deeper wound the cable inflicted wasn't operational. It was the confirmation, delivered in cold diplomatic language, that humanity's response to existential threat wouldn't be unified defiance, but the same fractured self-interest that had characterized every crisis in the species' history. Cross thought of the dead stormtrooper's face beneath his helmet in that Guam Trilene, of Kahlo's quiet defection from an empire he'd never chosen to serve, and found herself wondering, not for the first time, whether the deepest danger Earth faced wasn't the Empire's technology or Vader's terrifying reach, but the simple, ancient human tendency to sell out the collective good for individual survival. "There's something else," Webb said quietly, once the immediate crisis had been contained. He slid a final page across the table. Intelligence. Sourced from Kahlo's ongoing debriefings. Regarding the true purpose of Vader's approaching fleet. Ordain's cooperation agreement wasn't just about intelligence sharing. It included landing rights. Full Imperial garrison rights in 6 major cities. Effective the moment Vader's fleet arrives in system. Cross stared at the page, understanding immediately what it meant. The quiet phase of the occupation was ending. Whatever came next would happen in the open, in the cities themselves, and Vanguard would no longer have the luxury of striking from the shadows and vanishing before the Empire could respond in force. The war for Earth was about to become impossible to fight quietly. Vader's fleet translated into Earth orbit 41 hours after the cooperation agreement's landing rights. Clause took effect, and Cross watched the feed from a mobile command post disguised as a shipping container outside Manila with the specific, hollowed-out comm she'd learned to summon when a mission stakes exceeded her ability to fully process them in real time. The Executor-class flagship dwarfed even the Star Destroyers already in orbit, a slab of dark hull that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. Within hours, 6 major cities, Lagos, Mumbai, Sao Paulo, Los Angeles, Shanghai, and Berlin, the same population centers, marked for demonstrative force during the initial ultimatum, began receiving Imperial garrisons under the cooperation agreement's terms. Cross-watched footage of AD-STS walking down streets she'd once visited on leave. Stormtrooper checkpoints established at intersections that had, 3 weeks earlier, hosted nothing more threatening than traffic. Vanguard's response, coordinated across 16 cells now operating with minimal centralized communication to reduce the risk of the compromised intelligence. Cross's team had only partially neutralized, shifted from the guerrilla ambush doctrine that had defined the war's first phase into something closer to urban resistance, sabotage of Imperial supply convoys, intelligence gathering on garrison rotations, small extractions of civilians targeted for administrative processing, under terms the cooperating governments had euphemized into meaninglessness. It was slower, more grinding work than the Manila strike, and it came with a psychological cost Cross hadn't fully anticipated. Operating in occupied cities meant watching, daily, the particular indignity of a population adjusting to subjugation, some with quiet defiance, many with the exhausted pragmatism of people who simply wanted to survive whatever came next. It was during a reconnaissance operation in Berlin, verifying intelligence on a suspected Imperial detention facility, that Cross's cell encountered Vader directly for the first time. She would spend years afterward trying to describe the sensation to people who hadn't experienced it, and never quite managing it. It began as a pressure behind her eyes, subtle enough that she initially attributed it to fatigue. Then it sharpened into something that felt less like a physical sensation and more like being observed by something that had no need of eyes. A crawling certainty that her position, her intentions, her fear itself had become suddenly terribly visible to something she couldn't see or locate. Position report, she whispered into her calm, and heard her own voice carry a thinness that embarrassed her. Movement at the facility's east entrance, came the reply from Mallory. Position 200 meters away with a clear line on the detention facility's perimeter. Command vehicle just arrived. Multiple armed escorts. And a pause, and even through the comms compression, Cross could hear something change in his voice. Cross, there's someone stepping out who doesn't match anything in our threat library. All black. Cape. He's just standing there, facing our position. Vader did not move toward them immediately. He simply stood at the edge of the detention facility's courtyard, motionless, his masked face angled toward a tree 400 meters, distant with a precision that suggested he wasn't searching so much as confirming something he already knew. Cross felt the pressure behind her eyes intensify, and beside her, she watched Du Bois, a man who had once spent 6 hours pinned under sniper fire in Mali, without so much as an elevated pulse, go pale in a way she'd never witnessed from him before. Do not engage, Cross said, though the words felt almost redundant against the instinct screaming through every operator on that line to simply run. Hold position. Do not engage. For nearly a full minute, nothing happened. Then Vader turned, unhurried, and walked back toward his command vehicle, disappearing into the detention facilities. Interior without ever having taken a single step toward their position. The pressure behind Cross's eyes receded as abruptly as it had arrived, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that took nearly an hour to fully shake. It was Kahlo, debriefed on the encounter that evening, who offered the explanation that unsettled Cross most. "He knew you were there," the former technician said quietly. "The Force doesn't work like your sensors. It's not about seeing or hearing. He felt your presence, your fear, probably your intentions. The fact that he didn't move against you doesn't mean he couldn't have. It likely means he didn't consider 6 hidden operators worth the effort of a personal confrontation." Kahlo hesitated before adding the detail that lodged itself permanently in Cross's calculations going forward, which means he's not hunting Vanguard directly. Not yet. He's here to secure the garrisons and let Ordain's administration take root. That won't last. Once the occupation stabilizes, someone as thorough as Vader will turn his full attention to whoever's still resisting. Cross absorbed the assessment with the same clinical discipline she applied to every piece of threat intelligence, filing away the knowledge that Vanguard was, for the moment, beneath Vader's direct notice, a narrow, temporary advantage that would not survive the stabilization of Imperial rule. It gave her a window and windows, in a war defined by asymmetry and borrowed time, were the only currency that mattered. Whatever came next would have to happen before that window closed. She didn't yet know it would close in exactly 9 days, or that when it did, it would be Vanguard's own success, not failure, that finally brought Vader's full attention crashing down upon them. The intelligence that triggered Vader's direct intervention arrived through Kahlo, and it detailed something far more valuable than another garrison strike: the location and operational schedule of the Imperial command ship, coordinating sector, Terra Prime's entire occupation, infrastructure, a converted star destroyer positioned in geosynchronous orbit above Ordain's provisional capital, serving as the nerve center through which every garrison, every supply convoy, and every administrative order flowed. Disable that ship, Kahlo argued, and the Empire's carefully constructed occupation apparatus would fracture into isolated, uncoordinated garrisons vulnerable to exactly the kind of dispersed resistance Vanguard had spent 2 months perfecting. The problem, as Cross understood immediately, was that no force Vanguard possessed could threaten a starship in orbit. Their entire war had been fought within the narrow bandwidth of what conventional Earth capability could achieve against an alien occupier: rifles, explosives, terrain, patience. A star destroyer in geosynchronous orbit existed entirely outside that bandwidth, until Kahlo revealed the operation's actual target, not the ship itself, but the orbital shuttle facility on the ground that serviced it, where a skeleton crew maintained the shuttle traffic connecting the command ship to its surface garrisons, and where, critically, a data relay station housed the encryption keys coordinating Imperial fleet communications across the entire sector. Destroy that relay, Kahlo explained, and you don't just disrupt one ship. You force every garrison commander in Sector Terra Prime back onto independent, unencrypted communication protocols. It won't win your war, but it will make the Empire blind and deaf to itself for weeks, maybe longer, while they rebuild the network. The operation drew together the largest single concentration of Vanguard operators since the war began. 43 operators from 9 nations, converging on a heavily defended facility outside Ordain's provisional capital under cover of a synthetic sandstorm generated by a weather manipulation asset Cross still didn't fully understand, and had decided not to question. The plan called for 3 simultaneous breach points, a 15-minute window to reach the relay station's core, and an extraction that depended entirely on speed and the same sensor-blind terrain exploitation that had defined Vanguard's doctrine from the beginning. They were 4 minutes into the breach, charges already placed against the relay station's primary conduits, when the pressure behind Cross's eyes returned, sharper this time, unmistakable, arriving not as a gradual sensation but as a sudden, crushing certainty that the war's quiet phase had just ended. "He's here," she said into her calm, and didn't need to specify who. Vader's arrival at the facility wasn't subtle. He came through the main courtyard, with two full squads of stormtroopers and a red-bladed weapon ignited in his hand, moving with a speed that violated every assumption. Cross's team had built about a man his size and bulk. The first operator to engage him, a Sayeret Matkul veteran named Ryman, positioned to cover the relay stations. Southern approach, fired 6 suppressed rounds at point-blank range and watched every one of them stop in midair, suspended for an impossible half-second before clattering harmlessly to the ground. Ryman didn't get a second attempt. Vader's blade found him before he could reposition, and Cross heard the report over comm traffic with the same flat, clinical horror she'd trained herself to compartmentalize since the war's first hours. All units, charges are set. We are leaving now, Cross ordered, abandoning the 15-minute window in favor of the 6 minutes actually remaining before the relay's demolition charges detonated on their backup timer. Extraction team, cover the south corridor. Everyone else, converge on primary egress. What followed was the single most costly engagement of the war, not because Vanguard's tactics failed, but because Vader's presence rewrote every calculation. Cross had built her strategy around conventional. Stormtrooper resistance remained exactly as vulnerable as it had always been, cut down by operators who had spent 2 months perfecting exactly this kind of close-quarters urban engagement. But Vader himself moved through the facility like something the laws of physics had simply declined to apply to, deflecting gunfire with contemptuous ease, closing distances that should have taken seconds in what felt like none at all. And Cross watched 3 more operators fall to his blade before Du Bois, in a moment of tactical improvisation that would be studied by military historians for decades. Assuming any survived to write the histories, triggered a controlled collapse of the facilities. Upper structural supports, burying Vader beneath several tons of reinforced Imperial construction material in the same instant the relay station's charges detonated. It did not kill him. Cross understood that even as she pulled her remaining team through the extraction corridor, understood it with the same cold certainty Kahlo's warnings had instilled from the beginning, that something capable of stopping bullets in midair would not be so easily ended by a collapsed ceiling. But it bought seconds, and seconds were enough. Vanguard survivors, 29 of the 43 who'd entered the facility, reached extraction as the relay station's destruction lit the night sky behind them, and somewhere above, an entire sector's worth of Imperial communications infrastructure went dark. Cross would carry the cost of that night for the rest of her life. Ryman's name, and 13 others, added to a list that had grown far longer than she'd allowed herself to imagine when this war began. But as reports filtered in over the following days confirming that Imperial garrisons across Sector Terra Prime had, indeed, been thrown into weeks of uncoordinated, independently operating chaos, she understood that Vanguard had just delivered the most significant blow of the war, and that Vader, buried but not dead, would now be hunting them with an attention no amount of terrain or terrorism could indefinitely evade. The weeks following the relay stations destruction unfolded not as the triumphant turning point Cross might once have hoped for, but as a grinding, uncertain reckoning that tested Vanguard's doctrine against an enemy now hunting them with singular, terrible focus. True to Kahlo's prediction, Vader had survived the collapsed facility, and Imperial fleet communications, though crippled across the sector, gradually reconstituted under his direct, ruthless oversight. Garrison commanders who failed to locate Vanguard cells found themselves replaced, or worse, and the character of the occupation shifted from Ordain's bureaucratic administration into something far more personally invested in humanity's suppression. Vader did not hunt Vanguard the way Stormtrooper doctrine had trained its soldiers to hunt insurgents. He hunted them the way Kahlo had warned he would, through the Force itself, sensing concentrations of fear and intention that no amount of terrain-based sensor evasion could fully mask. 3 cells were compromised in as many weeks, their positions apparently intuited rather than tracked. And Cross understood with growing dread that Vanguard's entire operational model, built around evading detection, faced an adversary for whom detection operated on principles Earth's greatest minds couldn't begin to counter. The solution, when it emerged, came not from tactics but from Kahlo's deepening understanding of the very power hunting them. The force reads intention and emotion, he explained during a strategy session held in what remained of Vanguard's dwindling network of secure facilities. It doesn't read randomness. Vader can sense a cell moving with purpose toward a target. He struggles more against chaos, decisions made without a plan, movements without clear intention, because there's nothing coherent for him to sense. It was cross-recognized, both a desperate theory and the only path forward available to them. Vanguard's final major operation abandoned the careful, purposeful planning that had defined every prior strike in favor of something closer to controlled chaos, dozens of simultaneous, seemingly uncoordinated actions across every occupied city simultaneously, timed not by central command but by prearranged, randomized triggers that even Cross herself didn't know in advance. Supply convoys ambushed by cells operating on dice roll timing. Sabotage executed according to schedules, generated by algorithms designed specifically to defeat pattern recognition, biological or otherwise. The operation didn't defeat the Empire. Cross had understood from the beginning that total military victory remained, and would likely always remain, beyond anything Earth's special forces could achieve against a galaxy-spanning power. But it accomplished something more sustainable. It convinced Imperial High Command, watching casualty and resource expenditure reports climb, against a planet that refused every metric of pacification the Empire had ever relied upon. That sector Terra Prime represented a resource drained disproportionate to its strategic value. Ordain was quietly recalled. Garrison numbers thinned. Vader himself, after months of fruitless pursuit, was reassigned to priorities elsewhere in a galaxy that had never stopped fighting its own wars while Earth burned in miniature. Earth was not liberated. It remained, in the Empire's own administrative records, a pacified world under nominal imperial authority. But the garrisons that remained governed a planet that had proven, at devastating cost, that it could never be fully controlled. And Elena Cross, standing once more in a crater that had started it all, understood that humanity's war for its own soul had only just begun. The Empire had come to Earth expecting another conquest among 100 worlds, pacified before it. It left instead with a lesson no imperial doctrine had prepared it for, that a species without hyperdrives or lightsabers could still make the cost of subjugation unbearable. One ambush, one betrayal, one impossible act of defiance at a time. Elena Cross never saw herself as a hero, only as a soldier who refused to let despair become policy. The scars of that war reshaped Earth's nations, forged uneasy alliances between rivals, and left behind a resistance network that never fully disbanded, waiting in the shadows for whatever the galaxy sent next. Somewhere among the stars, Grand Moff Ordain's recall was filed as a minor administrative footnote. But in the ruins of Manila, in the quiet outback bunkers, in every operator who'd bled beside a comrade against odds, no strategist would have called survivable. The truth was etched deeper than any imperial record. Earth had not bowed, and empires that cannot fully break a world rarely get a second chance to try. May the Force be with you.